Great, thank you. Kate, I'm turning it over to you to lead us. And can I request my colleagues to bring folks in and let them settle down so that we can begin. But Kate, over to you.
Good afternoon, everyone. We've already had a fascinating discussion in the green room, so this promises to be an energizing and optimistic set of conversations. I'd like to introduce my wonderful panel. His Excellency Amitabh Kant, who you all know as India's G20 Sherpa. Thank you for joining us, sir. His Excellency Abdullah Shahid, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Maldives. His Excellency Tandi Georgie, Minister of Foreign Affairs and External Trade of Bhutan. Ms. Lisa Jackson, immediately to my right, Vice President for Environment Policy and Social Initiatives, Apple. And Mr. Angelo George, whose water you are all currently drinking, CEO of Bisleri in India. And I'm Kate Hampton. I'm the CEO of Children's Investment Fund Foundation. We're the largest philanthropic organization in the world focused on improving children's lives. I'm also a lifelong climate activist and very, very active in the COPs. So I'm sure climate change will be a theme in this panel. We've heard already this morning about the challenges of the energy transition from some great panelists. And for those of you that aren't experts on the topic, it's pretty clear that we need to halve global emissions by 2030. We're also looking at ecosystem collapse in a number of areas. And so decisions taken by governments, investors, consumers and businesses, even this year, next year, are going to determine whether we're going to succeed in our collective endeavor. I think everybody in this room has been touched in some way by environmental challenges, and so we welcome very much Prime Minister Modi's Mission LiFE, Lifestyle for the Environment, that he announced at COP26 in the UK, and has put the initiative at the heart of the push for sustainability, not just in India, but around the world, and as part of the G20 presidency. He's been calling for mindful rather than mindless consumption, so that will be a theme today. For those of you that haven't been tracking the story, the Paris Agreement set rolling targets for countries. They have to adopt plans. Businesses are now following suit and setting their own 5-year plans and targets. Non-state actors such as cities and others are following suit. And we're really starting to see a groundswell of effort focused on near-term delivery and investment. So we'll really touch on that today. We're also going to touch on some of the themes that have come up during the day on development finance and the international financial and multilateral architecture today as well. So I'm going to ask some specific questions to each of our panelists, and I'll make sure that we have 15 minutes of Q&A to be led by the wonderful Raisina Fellows. So starting with a question to Lisa Jackson. Obviously, Prime Minister Modi's initiative is really focused on sustainable production and consumption. So as one of the world's biggest consumer-facing companies, can you share with us what role Apple should play in sustainability?
Well, Apple is proud to play a leadership role. That's what we should do, but we have set that as our ambition and as our way of working. Apple is, as a company, has been running on 100% clean energy since 2018. In 2020, we announced that as a company, we are carbon neutral. And we understand and believe we must go far beyond compliance. But now the challenge, the fun begins, because Apple is also a manufacturer. We have a global value chain, supply chain. So we've set another goal. In 2020, at the same time as announcing we were already carbon neutral, we said now we want our global supply chain to be carbon neutral, so that every product that Apple makes is carbon neutral. And then we went one more step and said we want every person who uses an Apple product to have access to the same clean energy to charge their product that we have in our stores, in our offices, in our data centers, and with our manufacturers. So our ambitious goal is by 2030 to be every product Apple sells and its use to have neutral impact on our joint climate. Those are the kinds of things that demonstrate the role, I think, of the private sector in what is essentially, with great respect to the ministers on this panel. I'm a reformed government minister myself, but it cannot happen without the leadership that we're seeing here and that we're seeing from these countries. But the private sector has to meet them more than halfway and demonstrate what is possible and do it with innovation, and also demonstrate that you can be successful in the business community while still embracing the climate goals that were agreed to by the world.
Thank you, Lisa. And this positive circle of leading companies establishing new norms that then governments are able to regulate against is a really helpful development. I'm going to turn to Minister Shahid. Prime Minister Modi yesterday made a speech where he talked about the most affected needing to be at the table for the decisions that affect them. As one of the most vulnerable countries and a leading country in the climate negotiations, you played a huge role. How are you responding to this agenda, and how does the LiFE initiative resonate with you?
Thank you very much, Lisa. To be here while the G20 foreign ministers meeting is ongoing is a delight, especially given the fact that Prime Minister Modi has chosen a theme to the conference which resonates with the rest of the world: inclusivity, which is about one earth, one family, one future, which clearly tells us that G20 today is not an exclusive club, that G20 is ready under the chairmanship of India and Prime Minister Modi to listen to the rest of the world, to us, the climate vulnerable countries. Maldives is in the forefront of the climate challenge. We never contributed any to the greenhouse gases, but Maldives and the small island states are going to be suffering most. We should be listened to. Lisa, we have been making this noise, shouting from the top of our voice since 1989. And in those days, the belief is that these small islands are inhabited by just a handful of people. And then, yes, the islands may be taken away by the ocean. We will bring them back to the mainland. But what we were saying from 1989 to today is that our fate today will be your fate tomorrow. And now it is being clearly seen around the world. Yes, the ocean, the sea level is increasing, but it doesn't stop there. The glaciers, my dear friend, colleague, the Foreign Minister of Bhutan and I were just talking about, the glaciers are expanding, the forest fires are raging, storms are becoming more and more intensified, floods everywhere. So everyone is being affected. So it is important that the small islanders, the small people, voice is heard. And I thank Prime Minister Modi for continuously raising this issue.
Thank you. And because you mentioned your colleague, and because we are seeing so many good examples coming from some of the most vulnerable countries, I'd like to turn to Minister Dorji for a minute and just ask, you know, for a country that's largely on track for implementing the SDGs, what's your secret, and what could the global community learn from what's happening in Bhutan?
Thank you, Lisa. Let me also start.
I'm Kate, by the way. This is
Kate,
Lisa.
sorry.
That's okay.
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, Kate.
No worries.
Let me also begin by congratulating Prime Minister Modi and the Government of India for initiating Mission LiFE, which encourages people to change their behaviors so that the climate is protected and that also the SDGs can be achieved. For Bhutan, I think we have always been very fortunate to have successive monarchs, our leaders who have always prioritized protecting the environment ahead of economic prosperity. His Majesty, the fourth king in particular, was instrumental at the age of 16 years when he ascended the throne to declare that gross national happiness is more important than gross development product. Basically meaning to say that non-economic indicators and factors are more important for the well-being of the people rather than just measuring monetary and market values of the finished goods and products and services produced in the country. So as a result of which, throughout our development experience, we have based our development on the philosophy of gross national happiness with its pillars that are four. One is sustainable economic development, conservation of the environment, preservation of our culture, and good governance. And through these, we have initiated a number of policies, such as our constitutional mandate of requiring 60% of the country to be under forest cover. And today, I'm very happy to declare that 72% of our country is under forest cover, which sequesters 9.4 million tons of carbon dioxide against our emission of only 3 million tons of carbon dioxide, which essentially makes us one of the few, if not the only carbon negative country in the world. And along with this, also, you know, the electricity and energy that we have in Bhutan is entirely green energy, coming from 99% comes from hydropower, 1% comes from wind and solar. Not only do we provide green energy, but we provide free energy, 100 units of free energy to every household in Bhutan, including additional 100 more units for those who live in the rural and highlander communities, so that our forests are further protected. I can give you many other examples, but because of the time constraints, I will just summarize to say that all of our policies and projects that we implement are screened through this process known as the GNH index that looks at whether this policy or this project will bring more well-being rather than only looking at the economic output. So for example, if a project brings a lot of money to a community but takes away their time from engaging in community, or takes away more sleep, or disrupts their daily lifestyle, this project or policy will not be implemented. And therefore, I think many of you can already look up to see how we implement our GNH concept of 4 pillars, 9 domains, and 33 indicators that we pursue sustainable development. And I think the mission of LiFE is also very similar in that it talks about sustainable consumption. And as Prime Minister Modi articulated, from being mindful and deliberate utilization instead of mindless and destructive consumption. I think those are the key words that how GNH and LiFE complement each other, one to pursue sustainable development and one to pursue sustainable consumption. And therefore, I think the world can learn from some of these examples. I'm sure many other countries, there are many such examples. And lastly, I would just like to say that here, as we gather here today, as policymakers, as leaders, as governments, as decision makers, that it is us that need to set the example and live by example. We need to practice what we preach. We need to walk and cycle to work, drive electric cars, be vegetarian, serve fruits and nuts. I'm sure you've eaten the banquet outside. These are all small things that actually contribute towards sustainability and about climate protection. And as my colleague from Maldives has just mentioned, I would like to just end by saying that what Prime Minister Modi said is very apt for all of us, and that is Vasudeva Kutumbakum, one earth, one family, one future.
Thank you very much. Well, and I think the round of applause captures the fact that you're bringing values and purpose, or as economists would say, externalities, internalizing the externalities, for those that are more comfortable with that language. I would like to say, as a person who has never owned a car and doesn't drive, that my family gross national happiness is definitely higher as a consequence. So I'm now going to turn to Angelo George. So you're leading one of India's largest corporations, and we've heard from a global giant. We'd now like to hear from an Indian giant. Perhaps you could talk to us about how you're working on water, because climate change is really affecting water. It's of great concern to many. Many cities are running out of water. So tell us what you think you can do about water.
Sure.
Bisleri is one of the most trusted brands in India over the last 5 decades. We are in the business of providing to consumers safe and pure drinking water, and it's almost synonymous with packaged drinking water in India. I think when you're talking about water, it's important to set the context. A World Bank report indicates that India is possibly the largest user of groundwater in terms of extraction. But I think it's important for us to understand that almost 90% of this is consumed by agriculture in terms of irrigation, about 5–6% for domestic consumption, and the industry really consumes about 5–6%. At Bisleri, our business strategy is centered around responsible extraction of groundwater. Unlike those mega plants which operate on scale efficiencies, our strategy has been to set up a large number of plants closer to the markets to evenly extract the groundwater. Being closer in proximity to the consumption centers also reduce the carbon footprint in terms of transportation for us. I think when we look at India, we are a country blessed with enough rainfall, excellent rainfall. And it's too precious a resource to be wasted in terms of draining out. At every factory of Bisleri, we have very robust rainwater harvesting systems. We also work with local communities in terms of refurbishing the ponds and the water bodies which are nearby, which will all go into recharging the groundwater. In terms of our manufacturing, we convert almost 90% of the water that we process, and this in comparison to the domestic RO systems, which actually waste almost 40% of the water. When you're looking at the rural areas, we work with rural farmers, building and maintaining and repairing the check dams, conserving the rainwater and making it available to them through the year, converting barren land into fertile land. Not only that, giving them scope for multiple crops so that improve their livelihood. And I'm happy to share that our initiatives have made the largest water company in India water positive, that we actually replenish more water than what we extract from the ground. I think the government is also promoting water conservation. And we applaud the government in terms of setting this water conservation fee, where the levy goes higher and higher as you move from safe to a critical zone. Even the National Green Tribunal does not permit anymore extraction of groundwater by commercial entities unless there's a comprehensive impact assessment is being done on the environment. One of the challenges which I find is that the latest report, the National Water Commission report, indicates that over the last 70 years in India, the per capita groundwater availability has got reduced by 1/4. Now, that's a big wake-up call for everybody. I think the largest use being in agriculture, I think it's important for the country to get into water-efficient crops. I think prudent irrigation systems to ensure the water that you're supplying is fully utilized. And from a domestic consumer standpoint, sensible consumption, moderated, and accountability from the industry, process efficiencies to prevent wastage. And I would end by saying that to encourage the industry to really run the course in terms of conserving water, it might be interesting to look at developing a concept like water credit on the lines of a carbon credit. That if you're able to replenish, the credit for replenishing more water into the ground than what you consume could be traded or could be made available in similar kind of zones. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I'm now going to turn to the gentleman who's going to be at the epicenter of global diplomacy on many of these topics. How are you going to put the LiFE initiative and some of the things that you've heard today at the heart of the G20 presidency?
So, Kate, when the Prime Minister, Mr. Modi, talked about LiFE, he was really looking at nudging behavioral change. And that is critical because if you look at from COP1 to COP27, countries have committed to long-term goals of what they'll achieve in 2030, 2050, 2070, and so on. And we are looking at every COP on a long-term goal, and I can assure you that in 2049, many countries will talk about 2070 and 2080. Most emerging markets and developing countries are not responsible for carbonizing the world. If you look at the world and the carbon space available at 1.5 degrees centigrade, almost 90% of the carbon space has been occupied by the developed world. But irrespective of that, we in India are committed to be the first country in the world to industrialize without carbonizing. And that's why the Prime Minister felt that much like what we are doing in renewable, we achieved our NDC targets 9 years ahead of schedule. Much like we are driving renewables towards green hydrogens and decarbonizing other sectors, we need to push for individual and community behavioral change. How we live, what we eat, what we buy, and how we move. And that is critical because in the emerging markets, if you look at the growth taking place, the growth is all coming from emerging markets. And India in the next 4 decades will see 500 million people getting into the process of urbanization. And that means India will have to create 1.5 Americas in the next 5 decades. Every 3 years we'll be creating a new Chicago. And when you do this, how you urbanize and how do citizens become an integral part of that urbanization process will be critical. When America urbanized, land, gas, water were all cheaply available. And therefore, America's urbanization was made around cars, fossil fuel cars. And America made cities for cars and not for people. When we urbanize, it's important that we make our cities for cycling, for walking, and we make our cities around public transportation and mass transportation, so that urbanization is on the back of mass transportation. We are able to push our 2-wheelers, 3-wheelers into electric mobility and long-distance transportation into green hydrogen. And that, to my mind, would require a different mindset. It would require individuals to change their lifestyles. This would require a huge amount of behavioral change. But it's more important, when he was talking about it, that the developed world's behavioral change, when you go abroad, you will see lights being switched on, taps being on. And therefore, the world which has carbonized the world with 90% and occupied 90% of the carbon space, they need to ensure that there is behavioral change there so that countries, many of these emerging countries, they can grow in compatibility with sustainability in future.
Thank you. And just to do a time check, we've only got a little bit of time for the panel before we switch to questions. And I think we're starting to get to the heart of the problem. I'll come back to you in a minute to talk about global incentives for the change that you're talking about, Mr. Kant. But turning to Lisa, we've heard about this mindset change. You yourself mentioned the whole of society transformation that needs to be underway. Can you talk about how Apple can act as an engine working with communities where you have assembly operations? Many of those communities might be severely impacted by climate change themselves. And across your supply chains, how can you create this whole of society movement around a company like yours?
This is such a fascinating topic because I think the two things that people think of when they think of Apple are innovation. So we haven't really touched on innovation today, but some of what will allow this transformation to take place is innovation, is skipping over old ways of doing things into a future that is quite different. And I could spend more time, but I won't, talking about some of the innovations that Apple needs in order to drive to 2030. It is not a given that the scale of manufacturing that we do and the number of products that we have in the world and the energy that's taken to transport them and to use them, there need to be innovations in a range of areas which Apple is investing in and doing research around and encouraging partners in the supply chain to find. So, for instance, green aluminum, something that has to happen, is something Apple partnered with Rio Tinto and Alcoa and Alcan in Canada to come with low carbon aluminum with no direct carbon emissions, because we use so much aluminum in our products. And so those kinds of innovations. But the other one, which is so fascinating on this panel, and it really does sort of bring my old government life to my new corporate life, is that you cannot leave out the communities. Apple is a consumer products company. We make products that people buy and use themselves. And there's an attraction to the product that's about making my life better. If I feel like this product makes my life better, then that is really important to Apple. That's why we exist. And so part of what we have to do is find ways to encourage the kind of changes that Mr. Kant was talking about, that we heard, that are part of owning an Apple product. Not just that it was made with no carbon emissions, but that it helps you live a better life. We also need to work in communities. I want to give two very quick examples. I'm leaving here to go to Mumbai and outside of Mumbai to visit a mangrove restoration project that Apple is funding. It's not directly related to our work, but the idea is mangroves are so important to store carbon. But fishermen are looking and saying, hey, I have no reason to preserve these mangroves. They don't help me make a living. So the idea is to pay them to help preserve the mangroves so they can make a living, support their families, but we also maintain the blue carbon that's necessary.
Lisa, can I cut you off after
Please.
one example for the interest of time?
Yes,
Is
sorry.
that okay? Thank you. No, I'm sure many people want to come up to you afterwards and ask for examples. I want to turn to your counterpart in India. Plastics. That's single-use plastic is a really good example of mindless rather than mindful, but it's very convenient. So, you know, you've heard Lisa talk about the challenges of sustainable consumption. What can you do about plastics?
Sure. I think sustainability has been part of our core principles at Bisleri. In fact, all our packaging materials are 100% recyclable. And not only that, I think we were possibly one of the first companies to start plastic recycling as early as the 90s. And I'm actually privileged to share that as an organization, Bisleri is plastic neutral, that we enable recycling of more plastic than what we put into the market. I think plastic per se is a very versatile material which touches us in almost every aspect of our life. The issue is with mindless disposal, irresponsible disposal, which is leading to difficulties in sorting the waste and even in reprocessing. When talking about plastic neutrality, it is about demonstrating the accountability for reducing the scale of the problem. But I think the story is not complete without plastic circularity, which is collecting, recycling, and reintroducing it back into the system to extend the life of the product. Now, evidently when you look at something like glass, it's infinitely recyclable. But then there are associated problems in terms of the cost and the carbon footprint in terms of the additional multi-fold transportation costs and the heat that generates to bring it back in terms of reprocessing. Even in a country like US, which generates about 12 million tons of glass per day, I think hardly 1/3 gets recycled, and the balance goes into landfills to decompose over the period of a few million years. Coming back to plastic, in the context, what do? We have a reduction, reduce, reuse, and recycle has been our philosophy. Just in the last year, we have managed to reduce our plastic consumption by about 10%. We have been promoting reusable containers in plastic, and that's become almost 1/3 of our business today. And plastic circularity, when you're talking about, there are 3 challenges. Collection, I think there is disposal, collection, and repurposing. End of the day, a value needs to be added in terms of repurposing. We have been working with vendors to repurpose plastic into higher value-added items. And we convert, in fact, the entire uniforms in Bisleri are made out of recycled PET bottles. We convert them into apparels, shoes, bags, and plastic benches, serving the community and extending the life. But like our Prime Minister says, I think the larger impact is possible through behavioral change in the society in terms of making people understand that used plastic is a valuable resource which can be recycled.
Thank you very much. And I'd now like to, I was party to a really fascinating conversation in the green room, some of which I'd like to bring in here. The ministers from Bhutan and Maldives were talking about the common challenges that you have as countries that contribute nothing to the problem, and yet you face higher capital costs to serve your populations, to meet the SDGs. And we've heard a lot of talk today in a number of panels around development finance. You face high costs of capital as lower income countries, and you know, you've got a lot to do if you want to meet the SDGs for your whole population. So what do you think is the role of the international financial architecture, and do you have any recommendations for your neighbour who's going to be leading our G20 conversations? How can we help developing countries be part of the opportunities of green transition through green finance? Either of you?
Okay. I'm aware of the time, so I will make it very short. Bhutan was fortunate to be the chair of the LDC group for COP26, and therefore we are very acutely aware about the need for climate financing. I think it's very important to align climate action and development finance. In the interest of time, I can only just summarize to say that the vulnerable and developing countries at this juncture, like many other countries, are going through very tough and difficult times, not only because of the post-COVID economic turmoil, but because of the impacts of climate change. We see the impacts that impact countries like ours, the most vulnerable, who pollute the least but face the most difficult impacts. And we see this through increasing frequency and ferocity of natural disasters. And therefore, it is very important for the financial institutions, the multilateral development banks, to do everything possible to help us. And we know that they have made a lot of commitments, but on the ground, these have not really turned into action. For example, the commitments to have 100 billion annually to help vulnerable and developing countries as climate finance has not materialized. Even of the 100 billion that has been committed, for example, in the last 1 year, of the 51 billion that was given towards for climate financing for low and middle income countries, 65% of this was given for mitigation projects, as compared to only 35% for adaptation. Similarly, if you look at the $31 billion that went towards the high income countries, 95% of it went towards mitigation and only 5% went towards adaptation. Now, when you look at countries like Maldives and Bhutan, where we are not only faced by all these impacts, but where we lose opportunities because of conservation, adaptation is critical for us, and therefore the requirement for more climate financing to go towards adaptation is very, very critical for all of us.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll just end by saying that there needs to be more transparency of data so that we know exactly how much money is going towards climate-related Paris-aligned projects, so that the donors and the funders can accurately say that they have committed this many amounts. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's some support for that in the room as well. I'm going to ask my last panel question before we turn to the floor to Mr. Kant. In the Green Room, we were talking about another great leader from a vulnerable country, Prime Minister Mia Mottley of Barbados, and the agenda that she's put on the table, the Bridgetown initiative, that really sets out some of the things we were just hearing from Minister Dorji, how to use scarce resources, how to create more impetus in the financial system. And I've seen with India's putting this on the agenda of the G20, there's the announcement of an MDB expert group, and we have the US nominating Ajay Banga, who has a track record on both net zero and financial inclusion, potentially very promising. What do you think, or can you give us a sense of, over the next few months, where India would like to see this agenda go?
So firstly, let me say that the developed countries which had committed to providing $100 billion a year at Copenhagen in 2009 because of climate justice have not lived up to it. So, but irrespective of that, there's no shortage of money. There's vast amounts of money available. Private institutional funding is available. But there are risks involved, and private funds will not flow unless and until we are not able to de-risk several regions of the world. The risks in Asia, the risk in emerging markets, and the risks in Africa are very different from the developed world. So therefore you need new instruments of blended finance, credit enhancement, you need first loss guarantees. And that's what an institution like World Bank should be doing. They were constituted, World Bank and IMF were constituted post-World War II in the post-Bretton Woods period. They've outlived their utility. They should become institutions for financing climate change. They should become institutions for supporting sustainable development goals. And they should bring in the multiplier impact of indirect financing. That should be the modification.
Thank you. Well, and I have to agree. I think what's exciting is that we are seeing this real movement around this at the moment, and I'm expecting great things this year. I would like to turn to our wonderful Raisina Fellows. I had the pleasure of talking about some of these topics with them just a couple of days ago. I can't see anyone lining up at the microphone. Is somebody lining up at the microphone? Because if not, I could ask her. Oh, over there. Where, are you Raisina Fellows? No, because we normally, they're over there. Well, you're supposed to be near a microphone. There we go, there we are. Excellent, right. Thank you. Over to you. First question.
Hi. I'm Alexandra Seymour. I'm from the US and I work for the Center for New American Security. Oh, are you able to hear? Okay. So my question is to look at two different priorities, and anybody can take this. This might be best for Lisa. Looking at the climate goals that we're trying to achieve, as well as supply chain diversification kind of driven by national security concerns. And I'm wondering if there's a way, as we're making a lot of investments into both, if there's a way we can view them as complementary and to try to coordinate some of those efforts. What types of opportunities do they create for each other? Thank you.
Apple's investment in supply chain, first off, there are tons of reasons to diversify a supply chain. We've seen some in recent years. And Apple has invested, and of course, India has been a beneficiary of some supply chain investments here, and that work continues. Every time we do it, though, we need to, and Mr. Kant spoke of the advantage of building a supply chain, not from the very scratch, but starting with the belief in mind that that supply chain will be carbon neutral, and the opportunities that that gives. So I think the opportunity in supply chain expansion is that we can do it from the position of a mindset and governments that are very supportive of being carbon neutral, of 500 gigawatts of clean energy, as we've seen a commitment here, as we've seen in many countries post-Paris, this idea that realizing that the manufacturing sector has to decarbonize. So I think there's tons of opportunity in general in supply chains for manufacturing, and we need to show, and Apple has shown, we have over 213 of our suppliers have already pledged to be carbon neutral for their Apple production. What we find is once they go carbon neutral for Apple, they go carbon neutral for all their production, and our role is really to help mentor and show them that they can continue to grow and build a business and be carbon neutral at the same time.
Thanks very much. And now the more patient people over here on the left, who I didn't go to first, the lady at the microphone.
Hello, good evening. I hope I'm audible. Ma'am, my question is from Madam CEO of Apple. Ma'am, we know that most of the energy consumption of the product comes from the process of production. And also in this panel session, we talked about how important it is to indulge ourselves in behavioral changes, focusing on not on mindless destruction, but careful utilization. But the business model around which we see Apple working, wherein Apple comes up with new products every 6 months or in a year, and then consumers are promoted to go ahead and buy the latest version. Although many people go ahead and get their products recycled, but recycling also goes ahead and takes up energy. So this consumer behavior that Apple is promoting, which is now also being taken up by other business houses around the world, so do you not see this as mainly decreasing the rate of sustainability which we are aiming towards?
Thank you. And I'll take another question over there, and then I'll turn it back to the panel, the lady at the microphone on the right.
Hello, my name is Afni and I'm from Indonesia. Changing life habits and the logic of consumption in society is a big challenge, especially in countries where products or services are less accessible. What do you think is the best approach to convince these people to turn into environmentally friendly lifestyle? Thank you.
And do we have one final question, the gentleman over there, and then we'll turn back to the panel.
Good evening, everyone. My question is to
and
Mr.
if you
Amitabh
could
Kant.
Frame it as a question and ask one of the panelists, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
My question is to Mr. Amitabh Kant. Sir, we talk a lot about millets, and we are also celebrating the International Millets Year in 2023. We are also gifting, millets packs to the G20 delegates. But when it comes to taking action on the ground, government, seems absent. So FCI mostly procures wheat and rice through its quotas and not millets. So why don't we increase the quota of millets in FCI procurement and distribute them through PDS and midday meals? Thank you, sir.
Okay, so I think some were directed at you.
I'm happy to go first. Look, Apple believes that technology should be available, that we should be making technology innovations. That's what the company does. But our belief is that we should first build a product that lasts a very long time. And because Apple does hardware and software together, we can make software upgrades available to hardware for a very long time. There is no reason to have to go out and buy every year an Apple device, because the device becomes new every year with an upgrade. Over time, maybe for whatever reason you want, you're the consumer, you want to buy a new device. You can trade in the device you have. It has a value. It could be used to be resold. It could be, you can gift it to someone else, or you can trade it in, and then the fun starts. Because the fun of the process is if it can no longer be used anymore, if it is ultimately at the end of its life, and it has lived a long life by then Apple is innovating on taking that device apart, and our CEO has challenged us to make devices from recycled material from devices. Over 20% of what we ship today is recycled material. And that recycling process needs to be done with clean energy. So that is the idea of the circular economy, and that is what we have incorporated into our climate planning.
Thank you. And I think the other question was for Mr. Kant, I think?
No, that was a very, very important question, because we must realize that India was, when we started the Green Revolution, India was extremely short of food. We were importing food from the United States of America under a scheme called PL 480. We have, over the years, because we supported wheat and rice production in the country, we are now not only self-sufficient, we export food to other countries. But in the process, what has happened is that wheat and rice consume a lot of water. Now, what we are trying to do as a country is that we are trying to bring behavioral change, and millet is a very major part of this. So we made United Nations, we worked with the United Nations to declare 2023 as the year of millets, And now we're focusing on ensuring that every state, every G20 meeting, every area, we push for millets, which are very rich in iron and protein and calcium and consume hardly any water. And that is what we'll continue to do. And several states are now pushing for midday meals, etc., through moving away from wheat and rice and using millets. We'll keep pushing for millets and more schemes of the government. You can rest assured, but all this must be done simultaneously with behavioral change so that people start demanding that. If you try and push too many things from the top, you will have a reaction. And therefore, you need to make things like a people's movement, create a Jan Andolan, and that is what we are trying to do. Create people asking for millets is the best way to take it forward.
Thank you.
May I?
So we've heard, we're running out of time, I'm afraid, so I'm going to have to sum up. I mean, we've heard not just about carbon neutrality, but about being carbon positive. I think some of the panelists are really pushing the envelope, and because we're so close to the edge in terms of the climate challenge and many environmental challenges, actually moving to a frame of positivity and circularity, not just neutrality, is really key. We've also heard from the panel the whole of society endeavour and the responsibility that all of us have to work with all of our stakeholders to really push this forward and engage society, make it easier for consumers to take these choices. We've also heard about accountability, particularly accountability for those who are most responsible for the problem. But I don't hear the most vulnerable countries, the most impacted sectors of society waiting for somebody. I'm hearing solutions coming from many of those that are most affected. And we've also heard about the need to retool. We can't use the cutting-edge tools of the 1940s to solve the problems of the 2030s. So we're also hearing a clarion call across the panel for fundamental reform of institutions to meet the poly-crisis, to meet the climate crisis. And I think we're all really looking forward to the realization of this year's G20 slogan in driving this forward, driving forward these common values that we share. So I'd like to thank our excellent panelists for this discussion, and of course ORF and the Government of India. It's great to see environment top billing on the agenda. And I think our panel has shown that no matter where you are working in a position of leadership, you can always make a huge difference. So it's incumbent upon all of us, all of those of you who've shared this conversation in the room, to really reflect on our own lives and our own contribution, because we are running out of time, and the decisions we take today and tomorrow, not 5 years from now, not 20 years from now, are really going to determine whether the young Raisina Fellows are going to grow up in a world that's anywhere near as prosperous as the one that many of us have enjoyed. Thank you very much.